My job as a nurse at a local hospital involved long hours, and it wasn't uncommon for me to finish late into the night. It was one of those nights, just past midnight, when I finally clocked out after a grueling 12-hour shift. My feet ached, and my mind was racing with thoughts of my daughter waiting at home. She was barely 2 years old, and the guilt of being away from her gnawed at me as I walked to my car in the dimly lit parking lot. I could feel the chill of the night air wrapping around me, making me shiver despite my coat. The hospital parking lot was always eerily quiet at this hour. The flickering streetlights cast long shadows that danced on the pavement. I hurried toward my car, glancing at my watch. I could still make it home in time to tuck her in if I rushed. I fumbled for my keys, my mind racing with thoughts of my little girl. The way her hair smelled like baby shampoo and her sweet laughter. I could almost hear her calling for me. As I reached my car, I noticed another vehicle parked nearby. It was an old, beat-up sedan that looked out of place among the hospital's usual clientele. The engine was running, and the headlights were off, leaving the vehicle cloaked in darkness. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone was waiting for a loved one. But as I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, I felt a prickle of unease creeping up my spine. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart dropped. The sedan was still there, the driver's door open, but the driver was nowhere in sight. My instinct told me something was wrong. I shook my head, trying to push the feeling away. I didn't want to overthink things, but I couldn't help it. I scanned the parking lot, but it was empty. No one else was around. I took a deep breath and started the engine, hoping to put the strange feeling behind me. As I drove toward the exit, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned my head, and my stomach dropped. The driver of the sedan was standing by the back of my car, watching me intently. I hit the brakes, my heart racing. Panic washed over me as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Why was he standing there? Did I do something wrong? I wanted to scream, to drive away, but my body felt frozen. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out the sound of the engine. The man didn't move. He just stood there, an unsettling smile on his face. It was a sickly grin that made my skin crawl. I remembered the stories I had heard from other nurses about strange incidents in the parking lot. People getting followed, harassed, even attacked. I shook my head, trying to dispel the fear that gripped me. I hit the horn, hoping to scare him off. The sound echoed through the empty lot, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, and I finally got a good look at him. He was tall and gaunt, with dark, unkempt hair that hung over his forehead. His clothes were dirty, and his eyes, God, those eyes, were cold and empty, like two dark voids staring straight through me. I knew I had to get out of there. My heart raced as I shifted into reverse, but before I could even move, he took another step forward. "Hey, stop!" he shouted, his voice low and threatening. I slammed the gear into drive and pressed down hard on the accelerator. The tires screeched as I sped away, not looking back. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, making my hands shake on the steering wheel. The parking lot blurred past me, and I focused on the road ahead, willing myself to calm down. Just get home, I thought. You're almost there. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every car behind me felt like a threat, every shadow looming larger than life. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just empty roads and the occasional streetlight illuminating my path. Still, the sense of dread lingered. After a few blocks, I pulled onto the main road but still felt uneasy. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on the soothing sound of the radio, hoping to drown out the panic bubbling in my chest. But just as I relaxed a bit, I saw a familiar vehicle behind me. The same old sedan. It was tailing me, My heart raced again, panic seizing me. I pushed the accelerator down harder, glancing at my surroundings. The streets were mostly deserted, the few people out and about oblivious to my fear. I turned left at the next intersection, then right, trying to shake off my pursuer. Each time I glanced back, the sedan was still there, close behind me, never losing ground. I felt like I was in a horror movie, and I was the unsuspecting victim. The traffic lights seemed to take forever. Each red light felt like a countdown to something terrible. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't want to risk giving away my position. I had to get home to my daughter. The thought of her alone in the house, unaware of what was happening, made my heart ache. Finally, I took a sharp turn onto a side street that led into a neighborhood, hoping to lose him in the maze of houses. I turned off the headlights, relying on the streetlights to guide me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and the cold sweat on my palms made the steering wheel slick. I drove for a few blocks, keeping my eye on the rearview mirror. The sedan had disappeared. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief, but I couldn't let my guard down yet. I parked a few houses down from mine and turned off the engine. I took a moment to breathe, trying to calm my racing heart. I sat there, staring at my front porch, willing myself to get out of the car. The house looked dark and quiet, just as I had left it. I thought about the baby monitor sitting on the table, still broadcasting the soft sounds of my sleeping daughter. I couldn't just sit here forever. I needed to check on her. After a few more minutes of hesitation, I finally opened the door. The chill of the night air hit me hard. I glanced around, scanning the street for any sign of the sedan. There was nothing, just the quiet, empty houses. I locked my car and rushed to the front door, fumbling with my keys. I was halfway through unlocking the door when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of tires crunching over gravel behind me. My blood ran cold as I turned around slowly, my heart in my throat. There it was, the old sedan parked across the street, its engine running and headlights off. I could barely see the driver, but I knew it was him. He was watching me, that same sickly grin spreading across his face. I stumbled backward, the door slamming behind me as I fumbled for my phone. I dialed 911, my hands shaking so violently that I could barely hold the phone steady. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked, her voice calm but firm. There's a man. He's been following me. I just got home from work, and he's parked across the street. I managed to say, my voice shaking. Stay inside. Can you describe the vehicle? She asked. It's an old sedan, gray or brown, I don't know. I think it's beat up, I whispered, glancing outside. The man was still there, still watching, his grin now almost predatory. Help is on the way. I need you to stay calm and stay inside. Lock your doors and keep the lights off, she instructed. I followed her instructions, heart racing as I locked the door, feeling like a trapped animal. I moved to the window, trying to keep my breathing steady as I watched the sedan. It felt like time was standing still as I waited for help to arrive. The man didn't move. He just sat there, staring, his eyes fixed on my house. After what felt like an eternity, the distant sound of sirens echoed through the night. Relief flooded through me, but I still didn't dare let my guard down. The operator had instructed me to stay inside, and I knew I couldn't give him a reason to suspect that I was watching him. When the police arrived, their lights illuminated the street, casting long shadows that danced across the pavement. I could see them approach the sedan, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I held my breath, hoping they would confront him, hoping this nightmare would be over. I watched as they spoke to the man, their movements deliberate and cautious. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the tension in their body language. The man, however, remained eerily calm, that sickly grin still plastered across his face. It sent chills down my spine. Finally, one of the officers began to walk back toward my house, his flashlight illuminating my front porch. I opened the door just as he approached, desperate for answers. "Are you the one who called?" he asked, his voice steady. Yes. He's been following me since the hospital." I didn't know what to do, I replied, my voice shaky. "Can you describe him?" he asked. I nodded quickly, detailing everything I could remember about the man. His height, his clothes, his unsettling smile. The officer nodded, his expression serious. The other officer returned from the sedan, his expression grim. "The vehicle is registered to a man with a history of harassment," he said, his voice low. "We'll need you to come down to the station to file a report." "Is he going to be arrested?" I asked, fear gripping my chest. "We'll take him in for questioning," the first officer assured me, "but it's best if you stay here for now. We'll keep an eye on the situation." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. I could finally breathe again, but the image of that man's face was burned into my mind. It was a reminder that the world could be dark, even in familiar places. After filing my report at the station and going through the motions, I finally returned home. The police assured me they would keep a patrol in the area for the next few nights, but the sense of dread didn't leave me. I hugged my daughter tightly that night, vowing to protect her at all costs. In the days that followed, I tried to resume normal life, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept a close eye on my surroundings, and every time I heard a car slow down outside, my heart would race. It felt like that man was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for another opportunity. I couldn't stop thinking about the incidents at the hospital, the other nurses who had shared their stories about strange occurrences in the parking lot. Had they encountered someone like him? Were they safe? The fear had seeped into my bones, making every nighttime outing feel like a gamble. Even when I returned to work, I was hyper-aware of my surroundings, scanning the parking lot for any sign of that sedan. Each time I clocked out, I felt a rush of anxiety flood my veins. One evening, I was leaving the hospital, my mind preoccupied with thoughts of my daughter and the sense of normalcy I was desperate to reclaim. As I walked to my car, I scanned the lot, half expecting to see the old sedan parked nearby, but it was gone. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. I climbed into my car, locking the doors and taking a deep breath as I started the engine. I heard a noise behind me, something shuffling in the shadows. My heart stopped, and I turned around quickly, my racing heart. It was just a stray cat darting between the parked cars. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, feeling foolish for letting my imagination run wild. I pulled out of the lot, reassuring myself that I was being paranoid. The next few weeks passed without incident. The police had kept their patrols, and I felt a sense of normalcy returning to my life. I began to relax, allowing myself to enjoy moments with my daughter, rediscovering the joy in small things like bedtime stories and giggles. But one night, as I was tucking her into bed, I heard a car engine outside. My heart sank, and I moved to the window, peering through the curtains. It was the old sedan, parked across the street, its headlights off. Couldn't breathe. Fear gripped me, and I felt the walls closing in. I quickly closed the curtains and backed away from the window, my mind racing. What did he want? Why was he here? I called the police again, my voice trembling as I recounted the situation. They assured me they would send someone over, but my heart sank further when I realized it would take time. I sat in the darkness of my living room, listening to my daughter's soft breathing from her room down the hall. I was terrified, but I couldn't let her sense my fear. I had to be strong for her. The police arrived soon after, and I opened the door, relieved to see them. I explained the situation, and they assured me they would check on the vehicle. As they stepped outside, I watched them approach the sedan cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. Moments later, I heard voices outside, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I paced the living room, trying to keep my anxiety at bay. I couldn't let this man ruin my life or take away my sense of safety. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned, their expressions serious. The vehicle is registered to a man who's been reported for similar incidents. One of them explained, "We'll keep an eye on the area, but there's not much we can do unless he violates the law." I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. What am I supposed to do? Just sit and wait for him to make a move? "We understand your concern," the officer replied, "but for now, try to stay vigilant and report anything unusual. We're here to help, but we need your cooperation." I nodded, feeling defeated but knowing I had to remain strong. After the officers left, I locked the doors and turned off the lights, sitting in the darkness, the weight of fear pressing down on me. Days turned into weeks, and while the presence of that old sedan haunted me, I continued to try and reclaim my life. I focused on my daughter, playing with her, reading her stories, and reminding myself of the joy we could still find together. But I knew that the fear would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As a night shift janitor at an old office building, I've learned to deal with the oddities that come with working in a nearly empty building. The office was a relic from a bygone era, filled with outdated equipment, dusty files, and flickering fluorescent lights. My routine was simple: clean the floors, empty the trash, and check the restrooms. The building was quiet, and my job was mostly solitary. I thought I had seen it all until one particular night changed everything. It was a chilly evening in early October when the incident occurred. The building had a single antiquated elevator that serviced all 12 floors. It was slow and often groaned as it moved, but it was functional. At around 2 a.m., after finishing my routine on the top floors, I decided to take the elevator back down to the basement, where my supplies were kept. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the basement. The elevator jolted, then started its slow descent. I leaned against the metal wall, listening to the soft hum of the machinery and the creak of the elevator cables. It was a comforting sound, one that meant I was almost done with my shift. The elevator stopped suddenly on the 10th floor. I frowned, wondering if someone had accidentally called the elevator or if there was an issue with the controls. The door slid open, but there was no one there. The hallway outside was dark and silent, just as I had left it. I waited for a moment, then pressed the basement button again. The doors closed, and the elevator resumed its descent. But before I could react, it jolted to a stop once more, this time on the 8th floor. My heart sank. The building had been completely empty when I arrived, and I hadn't seen anyone else around. This was not supposed to be happening. The elevator doors opened, revealing the same empty, dimly lit hallway. I stepped out cautiously, checking to see if someone had perhaps come in or if there was a reason for the interruption. The hallway was deserted, with only the distant hum of the air conditioning breaking the silence. I returned to the elevator and pressed the basement button again. The doors closed, but as the elevator began to move, I heard something strange. It was a faint noise, like footsteps echoing from below. I paused, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. The elevator stopped abruptly again, this time on the 6th floor. This time, the elevator didn't open its doors. The soft hum of the machinery continued, but the usual creaking and groaning were absent. I reached for the door control, but the doors remained stubbornly closed. Panic began to set in. I tried pressing the buttons, pulling on the emergency lever, but nothing worked. The elevator was stuck. I glanced around, hoping to see some sign of why we had stopped. The soft echo of the footsteps grew louder, as if someone or something was moving around just outside the elevator. I could hear the sound of what seemed like muffled voices, though I couldn't make out any specific words. Then, without warning, the elevator jolted again. The lights flickered, and the temperature inside dropped noticeably. The one steady hum of the machinery became erratic, accompanied by a series of unsettling thuds, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor of the elevator shaft. I gripped the sides of the elevator, trying to stay calm. The noises outside grew more intense, and I could swear I heard whispering, though I couldn't make out the words. My breath came in shallow gasps as I waited for the elevator to move again. Finally, the elevator doors opened on the 4th floor. I didn't hesitate. I dashed out into the hallway, leaving the elevator behind. The corridor was eerily silent, and the lights flickered intermittently. I checked the area quickly but found nothing unusual. The building seemed as empty as ever. I continued down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers and footsteps had stopped, but I still felt a presence, as if someone was following me. The atmosphere in the building was thick with an unsettling energy, and every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. As I made my way back to the elevator, I decided to take the stairs instead. I didn't want to risk getting stuck in that elevator again. I hurried down the stairwell, my footsteps echoing loudly in the narrow space. When I reached the basement, I checked my supplies and prepared to leave, still shaken by the strange events. The following morning, I reported the elevator malfunction to the building's maintenance crew. They found nothing wrong with the elevator's controls or mechanisms and assured me it was in perfect working order. They dismissed it as a glitch or a temporary malfunction. But I knew what I had heard and experienced. The noises, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, they were real. I avoided using the elevator after that night, opting for the stairs whenever I had to work late. The building seemed to settle back into its usual routine, but the memory of that night haunted me. Even now, when I pass by the old office building, I can't help but glance up at the darkened windows and wonder what lies behind them. The elevator may be working fine, but I'm convinced that something else is lurking within its depths, something that I can't quite explain. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear those faint echoing footsteps, a chilling reminder of what I encountered on that cold October night. I had been working night shifts as a security officer for about 8 months, stationed at a large corporate office building downtown. It wasn't exactly the most exciting job, but it paid well enough, and since I had a newborn at home, the quiet nights gave me some much-needed time to decompress. My duties were simple: monitor the cameras, make routine patrols of the building, and most importantly, keep an eye on the underground parking garage. It was a massive multi-level structure that stretched out beneath the building, dark and cold at night, even more so than during the day. The garage was eerie in its own right. Its sheer size made it feel like an endless labyrinth, with row after row of identical concrete pillars and parked cars stretching far into the distance. The lighting was poor, barely functional buzzing fluorescent lights casting long, flickering shadows that made it seem like things were moving in the periphery of your vision when they really weren't. At least that's what I thought for a long time. Most nights were uneventful. The building emptied out around 7 p.m., and aside from the occasional late worker or maintenance crew, I was usually the only one there until the morning shift arrived. I spent a lot of time walking through the garage, checking for any signs of trouble, but it was always the same. Empty, quiet, desolate. That is, until the night when everything changed. It was a Tuesday, just another ordinary shift. I arrived at 10 p.m., did my rounds through the building, and settled into the security office to watch the cameras for a bit. We had a dozen or so cameras positioned throughout the building, including 5 covering different parts of the parking garage. It was always the garage that held my attention, though. There was something about that place that just didn't sit right with me. Around midnight, I decided to do my first patrol of the garage. The air down there was cold as usual, and my footsteps echoed unnaturally off the concrete walls. It was the kind of cold that made you feel like you weren't alone, like there was something lurking just beyond the edge of the shadows. I brushed it off, like I always did, and continued with my route. As I reached the lower levels, I noticed something strange. One of the parked cars, a black sedan, had its driver's side door open. This wasn't entirely unusual. Sometimes people were careless and left their doors unlocked or even ajar, but it was my job to check it out. I walked over, shining my flashlight into the interior. The car looked empty. No sign of a struggle, no personal items left behind. Just an open door in the middle of an otherwise deserted garage. I closed the door, making sure it latched, and noted the vehicle's plate number to report later. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another careless driver. But something about the way the door was open stuck with me. It didn't feel right. I finished my rounds and headed back to the security office, keeping an eye on the monitors. A little after 1 a.m., I caught something on one of the garage cameras. It was just a flash at first, a quick blur of movement in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. I rewound the footage, trying to get a better look, but whatever it was had moved too fast. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or some kind of glitch in the camera feed. I didn't think much of it at the time and moved on. An hour later, I saw it again. This time, the movement was clearer. Someone had darted between the parked cars on the lower level. I rewound the footage and slowed it down. It was definitely a person, but they were too far from the camera to make out any details. Whoever it was moved quickly, ducking behind the cars as if trying to avoid being seen. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back down to the garage. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. It was probably just some drunk who had wandered in, or maybe one of the late workers who had forgotten something. As I descended the stairwell, the feeling of unease returned, stronger than ever. The air down there felt thicker, heavier, like something was pressing down on me. I stepped out into the garage, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating row after row of empty cars. I called out, "Security? Anyone here?" Silence. I walked deeper into the garage, my footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. I could feel my pulse quickening, a nagging sense of dread creeping up my spine. I knew someone was down there. I'd seen them on the camera, but there was no sign of anyone. I checked between the cars, shining my light into the shadows, but nothing. No one. I made my way to the far end of the garage near the exit ramp when I saw the same black sedan from earlier. The one with the open door was now parked at a different angle, as if someone had moved it. My stomach dropped. There was no way anyone had come into the garage without me seeing them on the cameras. I checked the car again, this time pulling on the door handle, but it was locked. Everything about it was wrong. I stood there for a moment, listening. The garage was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. But then faintly, I heard something. A soft shuffling sound coming from behind one of the pillars nearby. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly walked toward the sound. Flashlight raised. "Security!" I called out again, trying to sound authoritative, but my voice wavered. The shuffling stopped. I rounded the pillar, half expecting to find someone crouched behind it, but there was no one. Just another row of parked cars stretching off into the darkness. I was starting to feel genuinely afraid now. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my gut. I wasn't alone down there, but whoever was with me was playing games. I backed away, heading toward the stairwell, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I wanted to get out of there, back to the safety of the security office where I could lock the door and monitor the cameras from a distance. But just as I reached the stairs, I heard it again, the shuffling sound, closer this time. I spun around, sweeping the flashlight across the garage, and then I saw him. A man standing at the far end of the garage, partially hidden behind one of the pillars. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see enough to know he was watching me. His posture was strange, unnaturally still, like he was frozen in place. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the garage. "You're not supposed to be down here. Show yourself." The man didn't move. He just stood there, half hidden in the shadows, staring at me. I took a step forward, and that's when he bolted. He ran between the cars, moving faster than I expected, disappearing into the maze of parked vehicles. I gave chase, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted after him, but he was too fast. By the time I reached the spot where he'd been standing, he was gone. I searched the entire garage again, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was he? How had he gotten into the garage without me seeing? And why was he down there, hiding in the shadows? I eventually gave up and returned to the security office, locking the door behind me. My hands were still shaking as I rewound the camera footage, hoping to get a better look at the man. But when I played it back, my blood ran cold. The footage showed me walking through the garage just as I had earlier, but there was no one else. No man. No movement. Just me, alone, talking to thin air. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew what I'd seen. I wasn't imagining things. There had been someone down there with me, but the cameras didn't show him. It was as if he hadn't existed at all. For the rest of the night, I stayed in the office, glued to the monitors. My nerves were on edge. Every time I glanced at the garage feed, I expected to see the man again, lurking in the shadows, but he never appeared. The next night, I was on edge from the start. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that whoever had been in the garage was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to appear again. As soon as I clocked in, I checked the cameras, scanning the garage for any sign of movement, but everything seemed normal. I did my rounds, trying to keep calm, but every creak of the building, every distant hum of the fluorescent lights, set my nerves on fire. The garage felt even more oppressive than usual. The shadows deeper, the silence heavier. I kept expecting to hear the shuffling sound again, or worse, to see the man standing in the shadows watching me. Around midnight, I was sitting in the security office, reviewing the footage from earlier in the night when the motion detector in the garage triggered. My heart skipped a beat as I switched to the live feed. There, in the far corner of the screen, I saw something move. It was him. The man was back, standing near the black sedan again. This time, he wasn't hiding behind a pillar. He was standing out in the open, facing the camera directly. His hood was pulled up, obscuring his face, but I could tell he was staring straight at the lens. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, completely still. Then slowly, he raised his hand and waved. I bolted out of the office and ran to the stairwell, my heart racing. I didn't care about protocol anymore. I wasn't going to let him get away this time. I burst into the garage, flashlight in hand, and sprinted toward the far corner where I'd seen him on the camera. But when I got there, the garage was empty. The black sedan was still parked in its usual spot, but there was no sign of the man. I checked every inch of that level, looking behind the cars, under the stairwell, anywhere he could have been hiding. but it was as if he had vanished again. I couldn't take it anymore. I called my supervisor, told him I wasn't feeling well, and left early. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every car that passed made my skin crawl. Every shadow seemed to hold something sinister. That was my last night working in that garage. I handed in my resignation the next day, telling them I needed to take care of my newborn and couldn't manage the night shifts anymore. But that wasn't the real reason. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want them to think I'd lost it. But I know what I saw. I know there was someone down there with me. Someone who wasn't supposed to be. And I can't help but wonder if he's still there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the next night shift guard to come along. As a night shift technician for an old warehouse, my job involved maintaining various systems. Heating, cooling, and of course, the lighting. The warehouse was a sprawling, multi-story building filled with shelves and boxes, all abandoned after the company had downsized years ago. The vast emptiness of the place could be eerie at times, but I had grown accustomed to it, or so I thought. It was late November, and the nights were growing colder. The warehouse, though functional, had seen better days. The lights in some areas had been flickering for weeks, a problem that I had been assigned to fix. The flickering lights were a nuisance, casting erratic shadows across the otherwise empty warehouse. I was determined to get to the bottom of it. I arrived at the warehouse around 9 p.m., armed with a toolbox and a flashlight. The building was as silent as ever, save for the occasional creak of the old structure settling into the cold. I checked the main control panel and noted that several of the lights on the second floor were on the fritz. I headed up to investigate. The second floor was even more desolate than the ground floor. Stacks of dusty boxes and outdated equipment were scattered around, casting long, ghostly shadows in the dim light the flickering lights created. The atmosphere was unsettling, making it feel as though something was just out of sight, waiting to be seen. I started with the light fixtures in the central aisle. As I unscrewed one of the bulbs, I felt a chill in the air. I dismissed it as a draft and continued working. The bulb had a loose connection, which I fixed, but the flickering persisted. It was as if the light were responding to an unseen force. I moved to the next fixture, but as I worked, I noticed something strange. The shadows cast by the flickering lights seemed to shift and move on their own. At first, I thought it was just an effect of the faulty lighting, but the shadows grew more defined and deliberate. They seemed to pulse with a rhythm, almost as if they were alive. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was just tired, but when I looked again, the shadows were still there, more pronounced than before. They seemed to be gathering in a specific corner of the warehouse, where the darkness was unusually thick. My heart began to race as I approached the area, trying to get a better look. As I neared the corner, the lights flickered wildly, casting erratic, strobe-like patterns across the floor. The shadows in the corner seemed to coalesce, forming shapes that were too distinct to be mere tricks of the light. I saw the vague outline of a figure, a humanoid shape, standing still in the corner, its features obscured by the shifting darkness. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling as I aimed it at the corner. The figure seemed to dissolve and reappear with each flicker of the lights. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I tried to convince myself it was just an optical illusion or a result of the faulty lights, but deep down I knew something was wrong. Determined to find a rational explanation, I climbed the ladder to check the ceiling fixtures. The wiring was old and tangled, but everything appeared to be intact. I tightened any loose connections and replaced several bulbs, hoping that this would resolve the issue. But even after doing so, the flickering continued, and the shadows in the corner remained. I decided to investigate further and made my way to the building's maintenance room, where I checked the electrical panels and circuit breakers. Everything seemed to be functioning normally, yet the strange shadows persisted. As I returned to the second floor, I felt a growing sense of dread. The warehouse felt colder, and the flickering lights cast increasingly erratic shadows. It was then that I heard a low, guttural noise that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. It was a sound that sent shivers down my spine, like a distant, muffled growl. I turned towards the corner where the figure had been, but it was empty now. The shadows were gone, leaving only the erratic flicker of the lights. My nerves were frayed, and I was about to head back down when I noticed something else. A faint, handwritten note was pinned to one of the beams, half hidden in the darkness. The note was yellowed with age and written in a shaky scroll. "Don't let it in. Feeds on fear." My heart raced as I read the note. I didn't know what it meant, but the fear I felt was all too real. I tried to dismiss it as a prank or an old joke, but the sense of unease lingered. The flickering lights and shifting shadows seemed to take on a more sinister tone. I hurriedly finished my work, avoiding the corner where the shadows had gathered. The entire time, I felt as though something was following me, watching me from the darkness. By the time I left the warehouse, the flickering lights had started to dim, returning to their usual state of erratic behavior. The next day, I reported the issues with the lights to the building management, but they found nothing out of the ordinary. The warehouse was as quiet and empty as ever, and the shadows seemed to have vanished. They assured me it was just an old building issue and that I shouldn't worry about it. But I knew what I had seen and felt. The shadows, the strange noises, and the chilling note were not easily forgotten. Even now, when I pass by the warehouse or think about that night, I can't shake the feeling that something dark and malevolent lurks within those walls. The flickering lights might have been fixed, but the sense of dread remains, a reminder of the night when shadows moved with a life of their own. I've worked the graveyard shift at the diner for about 3 years now. It's a small, 24-hour place just off the main road. A little run down, but still holding on to its charm. You know the kind of spot, neon lights buzzing outside, old vinyl booths, chipped countertops. Most nights, it's just me keeping an eye on the place while the world sleeps. The customers during these hours are regulars. The truckers on long hauls, insomniacs, the occasional drunk stumbling in after the bars close, and then there was him. He first came in on a Tuesday night around midnight. I remember it clearly because, up until then, it had been dead slow. I was wiping down the counters for the third time, trying to kill time when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up, and there he was, tall, a little hunched over, with a hoodie pulled up that covered most of his face. He walked in without a word, didn't make eye contact, and headed straight for the booth in the corner. I've seen all kinds come through the diner at night, and most of them are harmless, so I didn't think much of him. I went over, gave him the usual greeting, and asked what he wanted. He didn't even look at the menu, just grunted. "Black coffee." "Sure thing," I said and went to grab the pot. I poured him a cup, set it down in front of him, and waited for him to say something more, but he didn't. He just sat there, staring out the window into the dark street. I'm used to people being quiet or keeping to themselves, so I didn't push it. I went back to the counter, watching him out of the corner of my eye. He stayed for about an hour, nursing his coffee in silence. Then, without a word, he got up, left a few crumpled bills on the table, and walked out. No tip, no goodbye. The next night, he was back. Same time, same booth, same order, black coffee. He sat in the same spot, facing the window, staring out into the night again. He didn't say much, just nodded when I brought the coffee, and that was it. I tried making small talk, asking if he was from around here, but he just shrugged and kept looking outside. This went on for a week, every night like clockwork. He'd show up, always around midnight, always wearing that hoodie, always sitting in the same booth. He never ordered food, just coffee, and he never said more than a few words. I started calling him the regular in my head because he became such a fixture at the diner. At first, I didn't mind. He wasn't causing any trouble, and he was polite enough in his own way. But after the second week, I noticed something off about him. It wasn't just the way he never talked or the way he avoided eye contact. It was the way he watched. I know that sounds strange, because most of the time it seemed like he was just staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts, but every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me. Not a quick glance or a casual look, but this intense, unblinking stare. He'd watch me for a few minutes, then go back to looking out the window like nothing had happened. At first, I thought I was imagining it, maybe reading too much into things. Night shifts can mess with your head like that. But the more it happened, the more it started to get under my skin. It wasn't just that he was watching me, it was the way he did it, like he was studying me. There was something predatory about it, something that made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off, but after a while, it started to get to me. I'd find myself glancing at the clock, dreading midnight, knowing that soon he'd walk through that door and take his usual seat. The tension in the air when he was in the diner was suffocating, but I couldn't exactly tell him to leave. He wasn't doing anything wrong, at least nothing I could point to. Then one night, everything changed. It was a Friday, and the diner was busier than usual. A couple of truckers had come in for a late meal, and I was making my rounds, refilling drinks and taking orders. The bell above the door jingled, and I felt that familiar chill crawl up my spine. I didn't even need to look to know it was him. Sure enough, there he was, standing in the doorway, the hood pulled up like always, but something was different this time. His face, what little I could see of it under the hood, looked off. There was a bruise under his left eye, dark and swollen, and his knuckles were raw, like he'd been in a fight. He didn't say a word, just shuffled over to his booth and sat down. When I went over with the coffee, I hesitated. I wanted to ask what had happened, but something about the way he was sitting, hunched over, shoulders tense, made me think twice. Instead, I poured the coffee and muttered, "Here you go." He didn't respond, just kept staring out the window, his hand wrapped around the mug but not drinking. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong. That night, the bruise, the silence. It was all building into this unsettling weight in my chest. I tried to focus on my other customers, but I couldn't stop glancing over at him. After a while, I noticed that he wasn't just looking out the window anymore. He was watching me again, but this time he didn't look away. He just kept staring, his eyes following me as I moved around the diner. My heart started to race. I told myself to stay calm, that I was overreacting. But then, just as I was refilling one of the truckers' coffee, I heard a sound from his booth, a low, quiet laugh. I turned to look at him, but he wasn't laughing anymore. He was just sitting there, eyes wide, staring at me with this strange, almost hungry look. I don't know why, but that laugh, it sent chills down my spine. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and my hands started to shake. I finished with the truckers as quickly as I could and went behind the counter, trying to put some distance between us. I kept my head down, avoiding his gaze, but I could feel his eyes on me. The minutes dragged on, every second feeling heavier than the last. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I looked up and he was gone. His booth was empty, and the door to the diner was slowly swinging shut. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. He hadn't paid for his coffee, but I didn't care. I just wanted him gone. The next night, he didn't show up. I tried to tell myself that it was a good thing, that maybe he'd finally moved on or found somewhere else to go. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. Something about the way he'd looked at me, the way he'd left without a word. It felt unfinished, like there was more to come. Another week went by, and still no sign of him. I started to relax, thinking maybe it really was over. But then, one night, just after my shift ended, I went out to my car and found something that made my blood run cold. Taped to the windshield was a note. It was a simple piece of paper, folded in half, with my name scrawled on the front. My hands shook as I opened it, and when I read what was inside, I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. The note simply said, "I see you." I looked around the empty parking lot, half expecting to see him standing in the shadows, watching me, but there was no one. Just the wind and the faint hum of the diner's neon sign. I got in my car and drove home, my heart racing the entire way. For the next few nights, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that bruise under his eye, the way he'd stared at me, the way he'd laughed, and the note. It haunted me. I kept it in my glove compartment, too scared to throw it away but too terrified to keep looking at it. I didn't tell anyone at work. I wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding paranoid. After all, the guy hadn't done anything illegal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming, something I couldn't stop. A week later, just as I was starting to think maybe it was all in my head, he came back. It was a Wednesday night just after midnight. The diner was empty, save for one or two customers who had already paid and were getting ready to leave. I was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door rang. I looked up and there he was. He was wearing the same hoodie, but this time it was drenched in water, like he'd been caught in a storm. His face was pale and there was a new cut on his lip. He walked in without a word and sat down in his usual booth. My hands were shaking as I poured his coffee. I didn't want to go near him, but I didn't have a choice. I walked over, set the cup down, and was about to turn and leave when he grabbed my wrist. I froze. His grip was cold, his fingers digging into my skin. I could feel his eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him. "You're afraid of me," he said, his voice low and raspy. I swallowed hard, trying to pull my hand away, but he tightened his grip. "I just want to do my job," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He let out another one of those low, chilling laughs. "I see you," he said again, the same words from the note. Then, without another word, he let go of my wrist, stood up, and walked out of the diner. This time, he didn't pay, didn't leave a tip, didn't even look back. I never saw him again after that night, but the memory of him, his voice, his laugh, the feel of his cold fingers around my wrist, still haunts me. Every time I walk into the diner, I glance at the booth in the corner, half expecting to see him sitting there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night when the diner is empty, I swear I can still feel his eyes on me. Working the night shift as a taxi driver was never my dream job, but it paid the bills. I'd drive through the city's empty streets, picking up the occasional late-night fare and dropping them off at their destinations. The city at night was quiet, almost serene, with only the hum of my car's engine breaking the silence. It was a routine that I had come to accept, even though it wasn't exactly thrilling. One night in late November, a fog had settled over the city, wrapping everything in a heavy, suffocating haze. The fog clung to the streetlights and diffused their glow, casting an eerie, ghostly light over the roads. Visibility was poor, and the streets were deserted, save for the occasional car that passed by. It was a night that felt different from the usual, darker and more oppressive. I was on my way back to the garage after dropping off a fare when I received a call for a pickup. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, directing me to a rundown part of town that I hadn't visited in years. The address was for an old apartment building that had seen better days, and the fare was listed as anonymous. It was unusual, but I accepted the job and made my way to the location. As I drove through the foggy streets, the old building slowly came into view. It was a decrepit structure with broken windows and peeling paint. The dim light of a single street lamp cast long, distorted shadows on the sidewalk. I parked my cab in front of the building and waited. The dispatcher had informed me that the passenger would be out shortly. I sat in the car, watching the fog swirl around the dimly lit street. Time seemed to stretch as I waited, and an uneasy feeling began to settle in my gut. The fog seemed to thicken, making the street even more shrouded in darkness. My radio crackled intermittently, but there was no further communication from the dispatcher. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a figure emerge from the building. It was a person dressed in dark clothing and hunched slightly as they approached the cab. The fog obscured their features, and I couldn't make out any details as they climbed into the back seat. I greeted them with a polite "good evening," but received no response. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to get a look at my passenger, but the fog in the cab was thickening, making it difficult to see through the glass. I could make out only the vague silhouette of the person, their face hidden in the darkness. Feeling slightly unnerved, I started driving, following the address given by the dispatcher. The city streets were eerily quiet, and the fog seemed to envelop the car, muffling the sound of the engine and creating an oppressive silence. I could hear only the occasional drip of condensation from the fog-covered windows. The passenger remained silent, not making a sound or shifting in their seat as we drove. I tried to engage the passenger in conversation, but my attempts were met with silence. The atmosphere in the cab grew increasingly tense. The only sound was the soft hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the old car. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but the fog made it impossible to see anything clearly. After a while, we reached a deserted intersection. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long, ghostly shadows across the road. I turned onto a narrow, dimly lit street heading towards the destination. The fog seemed to be growing thicker, and I had to slow down to navigate the winding road. Suddenly, I felt a cold draft in the cab. It was as if the temperature had dropped significantly, and I could see my breath fogging up the windshield. The passenger remained silent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As I approached the destination, the passenger finally spoke. Their voice was barely more than a whisper, distorted by the fog. "Stop here," they said. I pulled over to the side of the road, and the passenger remained seated for a moment. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of their face, but the fog was too thick. The passenger then opened the door and stepped out of the cab. I watched as they walked away, their figure gradually disappearing into the thick fog. I waited for a moment, hoping to see where they went, but the street was empty and silent. I drove away, feeling an uneasy chill settle over me as I made my way back to the garage. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my gut. The fog seemed to follow me, and the streets were eerily deserted. I drove in silence, lost in my thoughts, and arrived at the garage well past midnight. The next morning, I checked the cab's log to find the details of the fare. To my surprise, there was no record of the passenger or the trip. The address given by the dispatcher was also missing from the log. It was as if the entire event had never happened. I tried to contact the dispatcher, but the number was disconnected. The building where I had picked up the passenger was abandoned and had been for years. No one knew anything about the address, and the place seemed to have vanished from memory. The more I tried to piece together what had happened, the more I realized that there was no logical explanation. The fog, the silent passenger, the mysterious disappearance. All of it felt like a haunting dream that I couldn't escape. Even now, when I drive through the city at night, I can't shake the feeling that something is lurking just out of sight. The fog seems to hold a certain menace, and the memory of that night lingers in my mind. The passenger who never spoke, the vanished address, and the eerie silence all contribute to an unsettling sense of dread. Sometimes, as I sit alone in my cab waiting for the next fare, I catch a glimpse of a figure in the fog, dressed in dark clothing, their face hidden in the shadows. I can't explain what happened that night, but I know that something was there. Something that shouldn't have been. The unseen passenger is a reminder of the darkness that lurks in the corners of our reality, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I've worked as a security guard for almost 5 years now, mostly night shifts. I've always liked the quiet, the stillness that comes after the sun dips below the horizon and the world around you slows down. But that silence can turn on you. It can become heavy, suffocating, pressing down on you until you realize how truly alone you are. I never thought much of it until the night Rob disappeared. Rob was my partner for the past 6 months. A good guy, older than me by about 10 years, he'd worked security jobs all his life and knew all the tricks. We'd been assigned to the night shift at a massive warehouse on the outskirts of town. The kind of place you wouldn't even know existed unless you worked there. It was far from the main roads, surrounded by thick trees, and the nearest sign of civilization was the faint glow of highway lights in the distance. Our job was simple. Keep an eye on the warehouse, make rounds every hour, and make sure nothing got stolen or vandalized. It was mostly automated, so not a lot of people went in or out during the night. Rob and I would take turns walking the perimeter, checking the loading docks, and making sure everything was locked up tight. It was boring, to say the least, but it paid the bills. That night, everything seemed normal. It was early October, and the air had started to cool, but the chill hadn't fully settled in yet. I remember the sky was clear and the moon was bright enough that you didn't need a flashlight to see your way around outside. Rob and I had been talking about some local football game while I drank my 3rd cup of coffee for the night. We weren't expecting anything unusual. Nothing ever happened out there. Around 2 a.m., Rob said he was going to step outside for a smoke. That was part of our routine. He'd take a break, then I'd go after. I watched him walk out through the back door, his silhouette disappearing into the darkness as he headed toward his usual spot near the fence. I didn't think much of it at the time. Rob was a smoker, a creature of habit. He'd always stand in the same spot, leaning against the rusty chain link fence that surrounded the property, staring off into the distance. 20 minutes passed, and Rob hadn't come back. That wasn't like him. Usually he'd be back within 10 minutes, give or take. But I figured maybe he was just taking a little longer to clear his head. The guy had been complaining about his wife earlier in the night, and I thought maybe he needed some space. Still, after 30 minutes, I decided to radio him. I picked up my walkie-talkie and pressed the button. "Rob, you there?" Nothing but static. I tried again. "Rob, you good?" More static. Now I was starting to get worried. Rob wasn't the type to just ignore the radio. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out the back door, half expecting to find him asleep against the fence or maybe just lost in his thoughts. But when I got outside, the yard was empty. The only sound was the distant hum of cars on the highway. I scanned the area with my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, but there was no sign of him. I walked toward the fence, thinking maybe he'd stepped out of sight. As I approached, I saw something on the ground. His cigarette pack, half open, with a few smokes scattered around. It looked like he had dropped it in a hurry. I bent down to pick it up, my heart starting to race a little. Where the hell did he go? I called his name louder this time. Rob? No answer. I checked the perimeter, walking along the fence, thinking maybe he'd wandered off to get some air. But after circling the entire yard, I found nothing. I started to feel a creeping sense of unease. Rob wouldn't just leave like that. His car was still in the lot, his jacket was still hanging in the office, and he wasn't the type to pull a prank, especially in the middle of the night. I went back inside and tried the radio again. Rob, this isn't funny, man. Where are you? Silence. At this point, I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure if I should call the cops or just keep looking. My mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe he'd fallen and hurt himself, or maybe someone had come by and messed with him. We'd had a few incidents with vagrants wandering through the area, but nothing serious. Still, the longer I went without hearing from him, the more unsettled I became. I decided to do another sweep of the warehouse. I checked the loading docks, the break rooms, and even the storage areas. Everything was as it should be. No signs of a struggle, no signs of Rob. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. By 3 a.m., I was starting to panic. I tried calling his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice shaking as I told him to call me back as soon as he got it. I even checked the security cameras, hoping to catch some glimpse of where he'd gone. The footage showed him walking out the back door, heading toward the fence, and then nothing. He never came back. I was about to call the police when my phone buzzed. It was a text message from Rob's number. Relief washed over me as I fumbled to unlock my phone. But when I opened the message, my blood ran cold. It was a single word. Help. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I immediately called him back, but again it went straight to voicemail. I tried texting him, asking where he was, what had happened, but there was no response, just that one terrifying word. I called 911, my voice shaky as I explained the situation, telling the dispatcher that my partner had disappeared and I had no idea where he was. They sent a couple of officers to the warehouse to check things out, but by the time they arrived, I had already searched the place top to bottom again. The officers were professional, but I could tell they didn't think much of it. To them, it was probably just another missing person case, maybe a guy who decided to walk off for personal reasons. They took my statement, checked the area, and reviewed the security footage. One of them told me they'd put out a bulletin, but there wasn't much they could do unless Rob showed up or someone reported seeing him. For the rest of the night, I sat in the office staring at my phone, waiting for another text, a call, anything. But nothing came. The officers left after a few hours, leaving me alone with the sinking feeling in my gut that something terrible had happened. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of Rob. His wife called the warehouse every day, desperate for answers, but I had none to give her. The police kept the investigation open, but there were no leads, no witnesses, no clues. It was like he had just walked out into the night and disappeared off the face of the earth. The warehouse replaced him with another guard, but it wasn't the same. Every night, I'd walk the perimeter hoping to find some trace of him, but all I ever found was the silence. The oppressive, suffocating silence. Then, one night, weeks after he vanished, I found his flashlight. It was behind a stack of pallets in the loading dock, tucked away like someone had hidden it. The weird thing was, the flashlight was still on, flickering weakly as the battery died. I knew for a fact that flashlight couldn't have lasted that long. The battery should have drained within hours, but here it was, barely holding on like some kind of sick reminder. I told my supervisor, but he just shrugged it off. To him, Rob was gone and that was that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had taken him. Now, every time I work the night shift, I get this feeling, this overwhelming sense that I'm being watched. I've checked the cameras a dozen times, but there's never anything there. Just the empty warehouse, the still night, and the constant growing fear that whatever took Rob is still out there, waiting. I never used to be scared of the dark, but now, every shadow looks like it's hiding something. Every creak of the building makes my heart race. And sometimes, when I'm outside, standing near the fence where Rob used to smoke, I think I hear footsteps behind me. But when I turn around, there's never anyone there. As a night security guard at a sprawling corporate office complex, my job was typically straightforward: patrol the building, monitor the security cameras, and ensure everything was in order. The office was a massive structure consisting of multiple floors filled with empty cubicles, meeting rooms, and the occasional labyrinthine hallway. My shift usually started at midnight and lasted until dawn, during which the building was almost entirely deserted. I had gotten used to the eerie silence and the occasional flicker of the fluorescent lights, but one night, everything changed. It was a frigid evening in early December, and a heavy snowstorm had blanketed the city. The office building was isolated, with the snow piling up outside and the wind howling against the windows. Inside, the building was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the old structure. I settled into my routine, checking the security monitors and making periodic rounds through the empty hallways. Around 2 a.m., as I reviewed the footage from the various cameras, I noticed something peculiar on one of the monitors. The camera feed for the sixth-floor hallway was displaying a series of strange, distorted images. The hallway was dimly lit, and the shadows seemed unusually pronounced. I tried adjusting the camera's angle and recalibrating it, but the issue persisted. The footage showed the hallway as it normally would: rows of empty office doors and flickering lights. However, every few seconds, the feed would glitch, and the shadows seemed to shift in unnatural ways. It was as though the darkness itself was moving, bending, and warping in response to something unseen. Curious and somewhat unnerved, I decided to investigate the sixth floor in person. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the elevator, taking it up to the sixth floor. The corridor was as silent as ever, with the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above creating an unsettling atmosphere. I walked down the hallway, checking each door and peering into the dimly lit offices. The hallway seemed normal at first glance, but as I continued, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows along the walls seemed to follow me, stretching and retracting with an almost sentient quality. The cold draft from the air conditioning made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I reached the end of the hallway and inspected the camera mounted on the wall. It appeared to be in working order, but the feed remained distorted on the monitor. I continued my inspection, walking back towards the elevator. As I reached the midpoint of the hallway, I heard a faint scraping sound coming from behind me. I stopped and turned, but there was nothing there. Only the empty, shadowy hallway. The sound persisted, growing louder and more rhythmic. It was as if something was moving in the darkness, dragging something heavy across the floor. I quickened my pace, heading back to the elevator. Just as I reached it, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whispering coming from behind me. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was menacing and urgent. I glanced over my shoulder, but again, there was nothing visible, only the ever-shifting shadows. I took the elevator back down to the security room, feeling a sense of relief as the doors closed behind me. I reviewed the footage again, hoping to find something that would explain the strange occurrences. But as I watched, the footage began to change. The distorted images became more pronounced, and the shadows seemed to take on more defined shapes. The hallway appeared to be populated by shadowy figures that moved in and out of view, their forms writhing and twisting in unnatural ways. I rewound the footage, watching it frame by frame. The figures in the shadows seemed to be moving closer to the camera, their shapes becoming more distinct and menacing. I saw what looked like ghostly faces and twisted limbs emerging from the darkness, moving with an eerie, deliberate pace. The feed grew more chaotic, with the shadows expanding and contracting as if in response to an unseen force. The more I watched, the more I felt a growing sense of dread. The figures in the shadows seemed to be reaching out toward the camera, their hands stretching and distorting as if trying to grasp something beyond the screen. The whispers grew louder, and I could almost make out words: pleas, warnings, and cries for help. The atmosphere in the security room grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided to shut down the security system and review the footage in the morning. I needed a break from the unsettling scenes, and I hoped that a fresh perspective would help make sense of what I had seen. As I left the building and stepped into the snow-covered parking lot, the cold air felt like a welcome relief. The snowstorm had intensified, and the wind howled through the empty streets. The next morning, I returned to the office building and headed straight to the security room. I was eager to review the footage with a clear mind, but when I accessed the security system, I found that the footage from the 6th floor camera had been completely erased. The feed was blank, and there were no recorded files for that night. It was as if the footage had been deliberately deleted. I reported the issue to the building management, but they found no evidence of tampering or technical malfunction. They dismissed it as a glitch or an error in the system. I tried to explain what I had seen, but they were skeptical and assured me that everything was in order. Despite their reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The 6th floor hallway continued to haunt me, and I avoided that part of the building whenever possible. The sense of being watched and the unsettling whispers never left my mind. I found myself increasingly paranoid, and the shadows in the building seemed to take on a more sinister quality over time. I began to notice strange occurrences in the office building. Lights flickered on and off, and doors seemed to open and close on their own. The temperature would drop suddenly, and I would hear faint, disembodied whispers echoing through the hallways. The building seemed to have developed a life of its own, with an oppressive, malevolent energy that I couldn't ignore. One night, while patrolling the building, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to move and shift around me, and the whispers grew louder and more frantic. I hurried back to the security room, desperate to review the footage, but the system was once again malfunctioning, with static and distortion replacing the usual feed. The hallway camera remained a source of dread and intrigue. The distorted footage and the shadowy figures haunted my dreams, and I couldn't escape the feeling that something dark and malevolent was lurking just out of sight. The office building, once a mundane workplace, had become a place of fear and unease, a constant reminder of the night when shadows came alive and unseen entities reached out from the darkness. Even now, as I look back on that night, I can't explain what I saw or why the footage was erased. The building remains a haunting reminder of the unknown, a place where shadows move with purpose and whispers echo through the empty halls. The hallway camera may have been the gateway to something sinister, but the true nature of the darkness remains a mystery, one that I can't quite escape no matter how hard I try.